So to add to ethnography, again, anthropologists go into the field, they do research on a group of people, a culture group, and they write in ethnography. So cultural anthropology and doing ethnography are deeply tied together. So when I went into the field, my ethnography was on the syncretism of the Cancun Maya. So really we're looking at ethnographic field work, which is, again, study of peoples. My anthropological process is this, and I use this in my daily life. Observe, analyze, adapt, apply, reflect, refine. A lot of us do these things already. Again, observe your surroundings, observe the people around you, observe interactions, analyze that, try to make it fit in terms of your theoretical, like function. What is that serving? Where is that coming from? Adapt to your surroundings, right? And then apply best practices. So application of those best practices, apply those to your field work or your learning experience. Reflect on the process and then refine the process is kind of the last one there. In terms of anthropologists and theorists, I'm going to run through these. Again, this is not a cultural anthropology class, which we would spend a ton of time with these things. This is native peoples of North America, so you kind of need to loosely understand these. Theories and theoretical orientation are really the lens that anthropologists are using when they go into the field. I've talked a lot about functionalism already, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. These will go into more detail as I progress. So functionalism, Herbert Spencer believed that society was like an organism, like a whole body part, where individuals acted as integral parts of that organism. Durkheim, also a functionalist, wrote Elementary Forms of Religious Life, and he really looked at the collective conscious and the sacred versus the profane, but also social cohesion. What are these social institutions doing to keep this society cohesive? Malinowski was also a functionalist, and then we had Radcliffe Brown as a structural functionalist. Ralph Linton produced many books, Study of Culture, culture groups, and he really looked at the role and status and reciprocal behavior among groups. Role and status is something near and dear to my heart in terms of what I look at and study. This could be birth role and birth order, status, prestige, those kinds of things are important. Remember, functionalism is looking at institutional's effect on social cohesion. This is what the institutions look like. Material culture. So how is it that our material culture is keeping us together? This is technology. Okay, so we could talk about, and it even goes further. It could be clothing. How does clothing keep us together? And our technology. How does our internet? How do our apps keep us together? Art and play, right? This is leisure. Social organization. How do we organize ourselves? This could be politics. This could be at a local level. Kinship. How do we keep track of relatives? Economic organization, this is basically tied to work, right? Means of production is also tied to that work piece. Political organization, religious systems. So these are the institutions of culture, and Durkheim and other functionalists really look at how these are keeping groups cohesive, together, intact, not running away from. And again, here's some definitions of these. You can flip through this, slide or whatever, or pause it on this slide for as long as you need. Again, these definitions aren't going to be super integral in terms of your grade, but these are the definitions of what I just kind of covered. Structuralism, Claude Lévi-Strauss is big on the structural side of things, and really he looks at the binary contrast. So how does society structure itself to deal with the binaries? And when I say binary, I'm talking about life, death, right, wrong, evil, good. These are binaries. So how do societies deal with that structure, that system? And how is the underlying patterns of human thought producing categorization of the world? Really, what Lévi-Strauss and some of these structuralists believe was that culture produces these patterns, cultural norms and patterns and way of movement and language and those things, and then we all kind of learn those through process. How do those things keep us, again, in a functional, cohesive way, working together? Cultural materialists or materialism is different. It's much more the scientific side of social cultural anthropology. Marvin Harris is the famous one here. He wrote the book Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches. I recommend it for anybody who wants the intro level cultural materialism lesson. And it goes through and talks about things like the sacred cow in India, right? Like, why is the cow sacred in India? Well, it turns out his kind of understanding of it is that cows actually provide more material benefit and economic benefit if they're alive than if they're dead. So for him, it wasn't a symbol of cultural wealth, right? Like an American system would be, we eat cows because they are a symbol of cultural wealth. And this is true in a lot of cultures without beef taboos, to be honest. We can look at the beef index in China, and we can see that the middle class is growing because of beef consumption. Opposite is true in India. India has the beef taboo. And his real question was, well, is this a religious thing, or is there more of a materialistic energy feedback piece here? And what he found was that the dung from the cows was used as fuel because there weren't a lot of trees in a lot of locations. Also used as a draft animal and for milk. So for him, the cultural ecology or the cultural economic importance outweighed the actual consumption of the beef. And really, he looks at certain things like infrastructure, structure, superstructure. And he goes, the infrastructure is kind of the natural laws. Superstructure goes all the way up to the religious kind of ideology. So he breaks things down in a neo-functionalist kind of way, but at an energy level. Feminist anthropology is definitely a critique out of early colonial male anthropology. Males were actually locked out of a lot of conversations because in many traditional tribes and band level societies, they had what was called menstruation huts or menstruation caves, where women would go for the full week, and kids would be allowed to go in there as well, but men weren't. And early anthropologists were men, so they would have no access to that information. Well, a lot of females, once they went into the field, started to gain access to everything that was going on, from oral stories being passed down to music to dance to how to cook. I mean, the foundation of cultures was actually being passed down in these female settings, and feminist anthropologists gave rise to this importance. Sherry Ortner kind of came with this idea: male is culture and female is nature, and it's pretty much kind of wrong. This idea that, and this is coming out of the critique of males having access to what was called public sphere, which was men behaving in a public sphere where they could be watched, and females kind of in this private sphere. Ultimately, is not necessarily kind of accurate, right? Sally Slocum was a female physical anthropologist and really challenged man the hunter perspective. A lot of times the perspective was put on, well, men have higher status in this society because they hunt, they bring back protein. Well, what she found was that actually women bring back more protein in terms of plant protein and stuffs. And they were actually bringing back the majority of the calorie intake. 60 to 80% women were producing and bringing back in tribes, in cross-cultural tribes, and men were kind of responsible for that 20 to 40%. So this idea that men had this economic bring home the baking concept really as a culture cliche is really false and part of a false narrative. And feminist anthropologists really helped kind of bring this to light. Symbolic interpretive anthropologists Clifford Geertz and Victor Turner are the big names in this field. Really, the idea is that symbols are means of transmitting cultural meaning, and culture as a mental phenomenon. And the idea is that we can kind of interpret and look at symbols, and they have this cultural allegiance in a way. Again, if I showed you a picture of an eagle, you could have all kinds of patriotic cultural things to say about it. And it's because we've been taught these symbols are important and bring us together. This is kind of the symbolic interpretive approach. Practice theory, this is Pierre Bourdieu. Really the idea of habitus, or people's habits or daily routines, and practice are the very, very important parts of society. He definitely looked more at everyday life, not necessarily just a ceremony or the big festivals. He looked at how people operate every day from every minutia thing that they do. And really, this is what's giving us the idea of culture. Okay. It also does tend to practice theory also gets into power. Power is a state level societal issue. Again, we're going to talk about societies that historically were egalitarian, where they were equal. There was no power. There was no status. And if there was status, it was equal status. So this idea of power has kind of shifted, especially in the last 7,000 years in human consciousness and culture. The idea of trying to gain it because somebody has it is an interesting one. And it comes out of things like envy and jealousy, which cultures that were egalitarian had interesting ways of dealing with that. Postmodernism is the critique of anthropology as a science. Renato Rosaldo is one of these individuals, and they start to challenge the rationalism and scientific neutrality of the period from 1920 to 1970. They start to get into hermeneutics, the study of interpretation of meaning, which is really moving us towards this intersubjective idea that, hey, we can't get into an objective idea of what these people are saying because it's not us. So how do we actually do this? We're basically telling a narrative, or we're becoming the myth tellers, acknowledging our bias. Activist anthropologists, June Nash and the Maya, she ended up studying the Maya in the Guatemala and ended up marching with them. She was very active. David Graeber's one that I talk about more because he's more recent. He's an anarchist anthropologist who believes that we should go back to self-government. So that egalitarian idea of political organization that I was talking about, David Graeber believes that it scales to our level societies as well. And that we should all be having self-government, which is, if there is a vote on a new law, we as individuals should all be voting on that law. We should not elect people of power to do that for us. We don't actually need that power structure. And he was a major voice in the Occupy Wall Street movement. So he's both an anarchist anthropologist and an activist. Activist anthropology is kind of a newer field, and it gets into these individuals believing that they, as anthropologists, can bring a voice to these groups that do not have a voice otherwise. Anthropologists in terms of what they study. So now I've given you the methods of what we do in the field, how we do it, participant observation, epigenetic perspectives, doing ethnography work, those kinds of things. And then I've given you the theoretical perspective, which most anthropologists go into the field with before, having that knowledge. So in terms of me, when I went into the field, I really was looking at it, looking at the culture groups that I was looking at through a kind of symbolic functionalist perspective, right? And that is, how are these symbols keeping this group cohesive? Was the equinox at Chichen Itza keeping the Mayan people believing in these Mayan gods? And in fact, it was. So again, the symbolic functionalism, I think, is an interesting combination of two theories. And I went into the field with those kinds of concepts already in place. Not everybody does that. Some people do go into the field and develop kind of which theoretical orientation they're going to use after their field work. But again, this is the perspective, the lens that they are using when they analyze culture. Things that anthropologists use to analyze culture, and I'm going to just kind of rush through these here, is microculture, right? And this could be a family group, a friend group. It's the smallest level of culture here. It's the most impact on you as an individual, okay? And a good example of this is going into different households and seeing how different families operate in terms of truth, reality, eating, everything about it is a microcultural level. Church congregations. Subculture is the next level, and we're really looking at a region, a community, a city, town, village. I put a state here because subcultures actually can grow out. So you could have a town as a subculture, a region as a subculture, and a state as a different level of subculture. These are all, again, speaking similar languages, having common symbols. Again, the idea of being Californian is a very subcultural concept within our macroculture. Macroculture, we're looking at the United States on this one. Nation states. Okay, so large culture groups. Symbols, imagine communities, the idea that I might not meet everybody in America, but on Thanksgiving, I could bet that they're eating turkey, right? Because this is an American concept, an American idea, macroculture. Global culture is the next level. Anthropologists, I feel like, have been striving for this for a while, which is we are all humans. We all have basic needs. We all have one culture. And again, we don't pick who we're born to or where we're born. These are some, I have 5 seconds left. These are some places to work as an anthropologist.